Hi, I want to talk to you a little bit about James Joyce, who is considered one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. Um, I, it was snowing here a few moments ago, very thickly and heavily, and I could not resist the temptation to throw on my coat and hat and go outside. I live right across the street from a churchyard, and so I asked my husband to take a short video of me reading the last paragraph of from the short story The Dead, which is the final story in the Dubliners. So it was just for fun. The snow reminded me of what the description of the snow in that passage, and the fact that the church bells started ringing as I was reading it was kind of cool. I kind of messed up at the very end, but I just did it for fun, and I thought it was a nice introduction to our discussion about James Joyce and the Dubliners. I want to cover a few points about Joyce, and I have my list here because if I don't write things down, I go off on tangents, and I don't want this video to be 15 minutes long for you. Okay, so Joyce was born toward the end of the 19th century. He is a modernist, so he belongs, kind of group him with other modernists like Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, Gertrude Stein, Ezra Pound, and those are sort of the big names in modernism. Modernism was a movement that it's mostly associated with World War I, and certainly World War I was kind of the watershed event that really gave steam to the modernist movement in literature. Now, modernism occurred in a lot of other fields too, like architecture and music and so on, but we're just going to talk about how it affected writers for now. Modernists were very disillusioned, became very disillusioned with the pillars of society or the structure of society following World War I. And the traditional way of looking at things and doing things seemed to fall apart in their eyes because of the terrible desolation and bloodshed that came along with World War I. Now, keep in mind that Dubliners was written in the right around 1904, 1905, when Joyce was only about 21 or 22, and he wrote those stories to sell to a newspaper to make some money. Having said that, he didn't write the final story, The Dead, until a number of years later, shortly before it was published, and the collection as a book was published in around 1914. So we see some of the modernist features in Dubliners, but those features are even more manifest in Joyce's later works, particularly Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, which was the last thing he wrote in late 1930s. Excuse me. Okay, so that's sort of the framework that Joyce was in which Joyce was creating these stories. Okay, so what makes him such an amazing writer? Well, a number of things. First of all, he pioneered many of the literary strategies or devices that we take for granted now in the 21st century. Things such as multiple or fractured perspectives, stream of consciousness, very, you might say, gritty or forthright presentation of what might be considered taboo subjects. All of these things Joyce did and was one of the first ones to do in his time. He was also a master of what I would call rhetorical control. I think some of the most amazing sentences in the English language were written by James Joyce, and the last paragraph of The Dead is a great example of that. So he really knows how to put sentences together to create a particular effect. He was a big fan of repeating words and phrases so as to create a very haunting, looming effect, almost a hypnotic effect, okay? He also was a fan, I'll get it right, of the chiasmus. And chiasmus is a mirror image of a phrase. So when words are repeated and then repeated in the opposite way within a particular sentence or paragraph. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. For example, if you go to, and by the way, if you don't have your copy of Dubliners, grab it. You can pause this little video, go ahead and grab it, because I want to take you to a few examples. The first example we're going to look at is the very first paragraph of The Sisters. And there's a nice example of a chiasmus here, as well as that repetition that he likes to use. It's it's the second sentence in the first paragraph. Night after night I had passed the house, it was vacation time, and studied the lighted square window, and night after night I had found it lighted in the same way, faintly and evenly. I guess maybe this is more accurate to say it's repetition. We have night after night and lighted, although we do have a chiasmus right there with lighted, night after night, and then lighted. Right? So he does that in a few other places. The last paragraph of The Dead, he uses chiasmus in this as well as repetition, and that's really what gives it the poetic effect. I mean, when I was reading that paragraph, I felt like I was reading a poem. And of course, there's quite a bit of alliteration there too. So he has a very wonderful way of choosing words and putting words together. So the last paragraph of The Dead, softly falling, falling faintly, faintly falling, that creates that almost a hypnotic effect. Another beautiful passage in which he uses a word choice to guide the reader's eye directionally. Okay, so think about what a director does in a movie. You have the camera panning, right? So our eyes are directed in a particular order to particular things, right, within the screen. And what we have here in the first paragraph of Two Gallants, that's on page 29 if you're using this edition, we have Joyce doing something similar. So I'm going to read this, and notice how he is guiding the reader's eyes down, notice, and then focusing on activity on the street, and then back up again. And we also have a chiasmus located in this paragraph as well. So let me read it to you and see if you can follow, and please follow along in your own book. The gray, warm evening of August had descended upon the city, and a mild, warm air, a memory of summer, circulated in the streets. The streets, shuttered for the repose of Sunday, swarmed with a gaily colored crowd. Like illumined pearls, the lamps shone from the summits of their tall poles upon the living texture below, which, changing shape and hue unceasingly, sent up into the warm gray evening an unchanging, unceasing murmur. Wow, isn't that amazing? I could read that sentence I could just read that sentence, or it's not that paragraph, I should say, over and over and over again. So that is his rhetorical control. There's other examples as well. And if you haven't read Ulysses, I think this sort of rhetorical strategy is even bigger in Ulysses because he matured as a writer. I mean, the thing is, we're reading these stories from someone who is only in his early 20s. Just amazes me. Okay. Now, the other thing that makes Joyce amazing is that he set out to capture the oral vernacular of Dubliners. And that comes through in Dubliners, the collection, but it comes through in a much larger way in Ulysses. All right. So we have that, for an example, the Two Gallants, about the two young guys, and one of them goes off and he's getting money off of this woman. Well, if you read their speech, Joyce was trying to capture in written form what was an oral dialect, and that comes through in that particular story. He also wrote about subjects that were considered taboo, And in fact, that was one of the challenges he had in getting Dubliners published. He dealt with subjects that publishers didn't really want to publish. So for example, in an encounter where we have the two young boys, and I can't remember if I've assigned you that in the readings. So an encounter is the second story in Dubliners. And in that story, we have two young boys that go off. They play hooky from school, and they kind of go off on this adventure, and they encounter a pedophile. And that was, he doesn't treat it as explicitly as we might expect in 21st century writers, but for the time, that story made publishers very uneasy. And that was one of the reasons. One of his publishers wanted him to take it out or to change it, and that was actually one of the reasons that the initial publisher decided not to publish Dubliners. So I don't want to talk to you about that. That's kind of another issue. He had some struggles getting it published. In Two Gallants, we have the relationship between the young man and this woman is presented very explicitly, and the fact that this guy is basically using her for money. That made publishers uncomfortable too. But Joyce was willing to, and this is part of the modernist perspective, to treat real life in a very unflinching way. We also have some allusions in the very first story, the sisters, to the priest. And it's very, very subtle, but we are led to believe that the priest may have been a pedophile by some of the comments that the old man makes sitting by the fire. It doesn't really come through very clearly, but there are clues there. In particular, this reference to the chalice breaking. That's a very symbolic, I would think that's a kind of a very strong symbol, right? And allusions to the fact that the priest was not in service anymore. So that's another aspect of Joyce, and we tend to take it for granted today, but for the time that was considered pretty unexpected or innovative. Two other aspects of his writing. He uses stream of consciousness, not so much in Dubliners, but that comes through in Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. And that's where we basically travel around in a character's head, and we're getting all of the character's thoughts as they're occurring, kind of an unfiltered narration. And the second thing, and this does come through in Dubliners, is the use of the epiphany. Now, an epiphany is that moment where a character suddenly gets comes to some realization or truth about him or herself or his or her life. And that happens in many of the stories, if not all of them. Let me give you an example. We have actually, I think, in almost every story, maybe not every story, but for an example, in Araby, Araby concludes with the young man's or the young boy's, I think he's a teenager, epiphany about himself. The very last sentence, gazing up into the darkness, I saw myself as a creature driven and derided by vanity, and my eyes burned with anguish and anger. And so he stopped right there at this epiphanic moment. So Joyce was a big believer in the epiphany as part of the structure of his short stories, and that's been adopted. I mean, that is something we see very commonly in short stories, right? Where a character has this, moment of realization. And in fact, one of the craft exercises you're going to be doing in the weeks coming up is to write an anti-epiphany. That's an interesting thing. Okay, let's talk about Dubliners a little bit. And I'm sorry, this video is getting much longer than I wanted to, but bear with me, it's not going to be too much longer. In Dubliners, Joyce really wanted to set out to present the city, an unflinching look at the city and the effects the city had on its inhabitants. And we get a clue as to the prevailing theme in the very first paragraph of the Sisters. So please turn to that. If you look at the very first paragraph of the Sisters, about 2/3 of the way down, it says, and that's my phone going off. I'm just going to ignore it. I'm sorry. Every night As I gazed up at the window, I said softly to myself the word paralysis. It had always sounded strangely in my ears, like the word gnomon in the Euclid and the word simony in the Catechism. But now it sounded to me like the name of some maleficent and sinful being. It filled me with fear, and yet I longed to be nearer to it and to look upon its deadly work. And you know what? That's exactly what Joyce does in The Dubliners. He is giving you a closer look at the deadly work of paralysis. He considered Dublin to be in the throes of a paralysis caused by the Catholic Church, the strictures of the Catholic Church, as well as the oppression by England, which of course was England was ruling Ireland, right? So that was part of the idea of paralysis. And that is a prevailing theme throughout Dubliners. When you read the stories, you're going to find that characters are paralyzed by their situations. Often they recognize a problem, but they seem unable to do anything about it. And a great example of that is Eveline. Another example of that is A Little Cloud, where both of those characters come to a recognition or an epiphany of the bad situation, of problematic situation they're in, and yet are unable to move forward. There's something else about Dubliners that I think is worth talking about, and that is we have a continuous sort of progression through the stories. Joyce did this deliberately. The stories deal with childhood, the first cluster, young adulthood, mature life, and what he called public life. And throughout those stories, we have an increasing awareness or consciousness of the protagonist. We do not have a common protagonist the way we do, for example, in all of Kitteridge, but we do have a collective protagonist, and this collective protagonist grows through life and achieves more of a conscious awareness, and particularly a conscious awareness of mortality and death. So, for example, in the first story, and here's something I do when it comes to collections of short stories. I pay attention to the first story and the last story, and I try to see a connection between them. And I think there's a very interesting connection between the first story and the last story in this collection. The first story, of course, we have a young boy who has been friends with his priest, and the priest has died, and he is taken to see the body. And we have a real, this young boy is still not understanding. We have I don't want to say, I guess he is an unreliable narrator in that he's very naive. He's offering a child's perspective. He doesn't really understand the magnitude of life and death and mortality, right? Contrast that to Gabriel at the very end in The Dead. And his last, we're traveling around, of course, in Gabriel's mind, and the last maybe 2 or 3 pages where he is reflecting on the fact that his wife is still, I wouldn't say in love with the young man, Fury, but still remembering the young man with a great deal of tenderness. And the fact that this young man, of course, is dead, has been dead for a long time, and Gabriel's awareness of how the dead are still present. He almost goes into this trance-like state where he can see the dead, right? So he's so aware of our own mortality. And I think that's an interesting comparison between the two. I'm not saying that that kind of awareness carries all the way through, but I think there is a sense of growing consciousness as you follow characters through this collection. I have talked way too long. I'm really sorry. I'm looking forward to reading your thoughts and reactions to this wonderful collection.